The chamber was never quiet. The Galactic Assembly floor held thousands of beings at any given session, delegates from over 300 species, each with their own translators, their own staff, their own whispered conversations running beneath the official proceedings. The noise was constant, layered, a living wall of sound that had existed in this chamber for longer than most civilizations currently seated within it. But when High Consul Orin of the Varath Coalition rose to speak, the noise dropped, not because the chamber respected him, though many did, because the chamber feared him, and fear had a way of making things quiet very quickly. Orin was tall, even by Varath standards. His scales were dark green, almost black under the chamber lights, and he moved with the particular slowness of a creature that had never once in its life needed to rush. His coalition had absorbed 12 civilizations in 60 standard years. He had personally overseen the terms of 7 of those absorptions. He did not raise his voice when he spoke. He had learned long ago that the quieter he was, the more carefully everyone listened. He let the silence settle for exactly 3 seconds after standing. Then he began. He spoke clearly, in the standard tongue used for formal assembly proceedings. His words were precise. His tone was almost courteous. He presented the Varath Coalition's position not as a threat. He was careful never to use that word, but as a practical arrangement, an offer of structured integration that would benefit all parties involved. Humanity would surrender administrative control of 3 Outer Rim systems. Humanity would reduce its active fleet to a ceremonial capacity. Humanity would accept Varath economic oversight within 1 standard year. Non-compliance, he said, would be treated as a declaration of hostility against the Coalition. And the Coalition, he did not need to add, had a well-documented record of how it handled hostility. He sat down. The chamber did not explode into noise. It buzzed, that low, controlled kind of noise that meant everyone was talking to their neighbors at once, processing what had just been said, reading the faces around them. Some delegates looked uncomfortable. A few looked relieved. None of them were human, and that was not a coincidence. The species that looked relieved were the ones thinking, "At least it is not us." Observer Lyrian Sol sat in the non-aligned gallery, 3 rows above the main floor, and wrote quickly in her record journal. She noted the precise wording Orin had used. She noted the reaction of the surrounding delegations. She noted the way the Varath advisors arranged themselves behind their consul, relaxed, unhurried, the body language of people who expected this to go the way it had always gone before. Then she turned her attention to the human delegation. There were 4 of them at the human table, 2 junior staff who handled documentation, 1 senior aide, and Ambassador Sarath Voss, who sat in the center chair with his hands folded on the table in front of him and watched Orin finish speaking with an expression that Lyrian found, even at this distance, difficult to read. He was not angry. He was not pale with fear. He was not leaning toward his aide for urgent whispered consultation. He was simply watching, with the calm of someone who had seen exactly this before, or had always known it was coming. When the assembly chair called on the human delegation to respond, Voss stood. He was not physically impressive. Medium height, dark hair going gray at the sides, a plain diplomatic suit without medals or insignia. He did not look like a man who commanded anything. He looked like someone's administrator. He thanked High Consul Orin for the clarity of the terms. The chamber's buzz sharpened into something closer to collective disbelief. Voss said that humanity took the Coalition's position seriously and intended to treat it with the full weight of proper assembly procedure. He said that humanity would need 30 standard days to formally review the terms, consult with its governing bodies, and prepare an official response through the correct diplomatic channels. He asked the assembly chair to note the request for response time on the official record. Then he sat down. There was a pause, just a small one, the kind of pause that happens when everyone in a room expects something more and it does not come. Oren looked at the human table with an expression that was not quite amusement and not quite contempt. It was somewhere in between, the look of a predator who has just watched small prey run into a corner. He said nothing. He did not need to. His advisors exchanged glances. The 30 days were granted without objection. No one in the chamber expected them to change the outcome. Lyrian wrote in her journal. The human thanked him. He asked for time. He sat down. He may simply be afraid and buying himself days to accept the reality of his position. She underlined that last sentence. Then she watched Voss stand from the table at the close of session, exchange a few words with his aide, and walk toward the corridor exit. His pace was unhurried. His face was neutral. He did not look back at the Verath table. She thought he looked, if anything, slightly tired, like a man who had just sat through a long meeting about something that was already settled. She did not yet understand that she was right about that last part. The corridor outside the main chamber was long and curved along the outer edge of the assembly structure, with wide transparent panels that looked out into space. At this distance from any star, space was deeply dark, the kind of dark that made distances feel abstract and very real at the same time. Voss walked to the midpoint of the corridor and stopped. His aide had stayed behind. He was alone. He stood at the transparent panel for a moment and looked out at nothing in particular. Then he took out a small communications device, personal grade, not the official diplomatic system, and typed a short message. 14 words. He looked at it once, then sent it. The message arrived at a relay 2 systems away within minutes, re-encrypted twice along the route. It arrived at its destination without a visible origin point. It read, "Clock starts now." He put the device away. He stood at the window for another moment. Outside, the stars were where they had always been, still, patient, completely indifferent to everything happening inside the chamber behind him. He did not look troubled. He did not look afraid. He looked like a man who had just started a timer that he had set a very long time ago, and who knew, with the particular quiet confidence of someone who had checked their work twice, and then a third time, exactly what was going to happen when it reached 0. He turned from the window and walked back down the corridor. His footsteps were even. His hands were still. The corridor lights were bright and steady, and the space outside was dark and full of distances that no one in that chamber had yet bothered to measure carefully enough. That was, in the end, the first mistake. Not the ultimatum, not the public staging of it, though that had been arrogant in its own right. The first real mistake was the assumption underneath all of it, the assumption shared by Oren, by the watching delegations, by every analyst and observer in that chamber, that silence meant weakness, that a people who did not shout when threatened had nothing to say, that asking for 30 days was what a frightened species did when it needed time to process how completely outmatched it was. No one in the chamber that day stopped to consider a different explanation. No one asked what else 30 days might be useful for. No one looked at Voss and thought, what if he is not afraid? What if he is simply waiting? What if everything that needs to happen has already been set in motion, and the 30 days are not for humanity to prepare, because the preparation is already done, but for the timer to run? Lyrian came closest. She was a careful observer, trained for exactly this kind of documentation, and some instinct she could not yet name made her watch the human ambassador longer than she watched Oren after the session ended. She noticed the steadiness in him. She noted it in her journal, but she folded it into the same explanation as everyone else. Fear sometimes made creatures very still. Stillness was not the same as strength. She would remember that assumption later. She would remember it for the rest of her life, in the way that a person remembers the exact moment before something changes permanently. The last second of a world that made a particular kind of sense, right before it stopped making that kind of sense forever. Back in the chamber, the Verath advisors were already drafting preliminary occupation frameworks for the 3 Outer Rim systems. They were experienced at this. They knew how to move quickly once the response period expired. The frameworks would be ready in 2 weeks. They would spend the remaining days refining logistics. They had done this before. They knew how it went. At a listening post near the edge of Verath space, far from the assembly and its grand chamber and its layered noise, Commander Dax Orel was on his 3rd cup of coffee when his system flagged an incoming encrypted message. He set the cup down. He read the message header. He opened it through the correct authorization sequence and read the body of the message, which was short and contained no elaboration. He read it twice, not because he did not understand it, because it was the message he had been told 14 months ago that he might one day receive, and he wanted to make sure he was reading it correctly before he did anything at all. He was reading it correctly. He saved it to the sealed log. He leaned back in his chair. Outside the viewport of the listening post, Verath space stretched away into dark, quiet, busy, full of ships and signals, and the confident movement of a coalition that believed itself to be the most dangerous thing in this part of the galaxy. Orel picked up his coffee. He looked at the stars for a moment. Then he looked back at his console and began the first of several very small, very quiet actions that would, in 30 days, combine with several hundred other very small and very quiet actions into something the Verath Coalition did not currently have a word for. He was not in a hurry. There was no need to be. The clock had already started. The 30 days did not look like much from the outside. That was the point. The Verath Coalition's intelligence apparatus was thorough. Orin had not absorbed 12 civilizations by being careless about information. His analysts watched human space with the kind of attention that came from professional confidence, the assumption that they knew what to look for, and that what they were looking for would eventually appear. Fleet movements, supply convoys rerouting toward border systems, increased energy signatures at known military installations. The things that a species preparing for conflict always did, because conflict required preparation, and preparation left traces. They watched for 30 days. They found almost nothing. A few standard supply transports moved along established routes. Routine patrol ships followed their usual schedules. One minor repair convoy docked at a border station for 3 days and then left. Energy readings across human military installations remained at normal operating levels. There was no surge, no repositioning, no mobilization of the kind their models predicted would be necessary if humanity intended to resist. Orin reviewed the reports personally each morning over the first 2 weeks. By the 3rd week, he had stopped reviewing them himself and left it to his senior analyst, because the reports were saying the same thing every day, and it was not a thing that required his personal attention. Humanity was not moving. Humanity was, as far as his intelligence apparatus could determine, doing very little. He found this satisfying. It confirmed what he had believed since before the assembly session, that humanity had assessed its position, understood the reality of what it was facing, and was now quietly preparing its government and its population for the terms it was going to accept. The 30 days were a face-saving measure. He had seen it before. Species with any pride at all needed a window of time between the ultimatum and the compliance, so that they could tell their people they had considered all options before choosing the rational path. He was generous about this. He understood pride. In the assembly halls, the shift was gradual but visible. The smaller species that had been cautiously non-aligned began moving their public positions. Not dramatically, no formal statements, no declared affiliations, just small things. A delegate from one of the minor systems began attending Verath-hosted social functions that it had previously declined. 2 trading agreements between coalition members and previously neutral parties were announced within the same week. The Assembly's informal social architecture was rearranging itself around the assumption of a Verath victory. The way water found new paths around a stone that had just been placed in a stream. Observer Lyrian noted all of this. She was thorough in the way that people who have chosen documentation as their life's work tended to be, not because every detail mattered, but because you never knew in advance which ones did. She attended 3 separate informal assembly functions that week, spoke to 11 different delegates, and compiled a clear picture of the consensus forming across the chamber. The consensus was, humanity would comply. The only question was whether it would do so gracefully or make a difficult final gesture that would be quickly forgotten. She requested an interview with Ambassador Voss on day 18. He agreed the same afternoon, which surprised her. She had expected to wait, or to be redirected to a junior staff member. Instead, she was shown to a small meeting room off the main diplomatic corridor, and Voss arrived 3 minutes after she did, carrying a cup of something warm and offering her one, which she declined. She had prepared careful questions. She had structured them to give him room to say something revealing without realizing it, a technique she had used successfully with dozens of subjects over her career as an observer. She asked about humanity's history with the Assembly. She asked about the coalition's regional influence. She asked, delicately, what humanity's governing bodies had said in response to the current situation. Voss answered every question. He was pleasant about it. He did not deflect or give non-answers. He spoke clearly and at reasonable length and said things that were, individually, perfectly true, and collectively, told her almost nothing she had not already known. He was the most cooperative subject she had ever interviewed who left her feeling she had learned the least. At the end of the meeting, she asked him, directly, whether humanity intended to comply with the coalition's terms. He looked at her with the same calm expression he had worn on the assembly floor. He said that humanity's formal response would be submitted on day 30, as requested, through proper assembly channels, and that the response would speak for itself. She thanked him. He walked her to the corridor. He was polite all the way to the door. She stood in the corridor afterward and wrote one word in her journal, careful. She did not mean it as a compliment yet. She was not sure what she meant it as. On day 22, back in her quarters, she did something she had not originally planned to do. She pulled up the historical archive on human conflicts, not their current military record, which she had already reviewed, but the older material. The wars they had fought among themselves before they reached the stars. The ones they had won decisively. She had assumed this would be background color, context for understanding their military culture, their tolerance for casualties, their emotional relationship with conflict. What she found instead pulled her forward in her chair and kept her there for 4 hours. The pattern was not obvious at first. It required looking at the full shape of each conflict rather than the individual events within it. When she did that, when she stopped reading the battles and started reading the architecture of each war, she saw it. Humanity's decisive victories did not tend to have a single turning point. They did not follow the dramatic shape that most military history followed: the build-up, the key engagement, the collapse of one side. Instead, they had a different shape, one that was harder to see while it was happening. The losing side in a human conflict that humanity intended to win would begin to experience, quietly and without obvious cause, a degradation in its ability to function. Supply lines that worked would gradually stop working. Communication infrastructure would develop problems. Economic systems would slow. And by the time the losing side understood that the war was already decided, the deciding had been done so far in advance and so quietly that tracing it back to its origin point was almost impossible. Humanity did not tend to win its wars at the moment of victory. It tended to win them weeks or months before that moment, in 100 small and invisible actions that most historians had dismissed as logistical details. Lyrian sat with this for a long time. Then she looked up at her calendar, day 22 of 30. She opened a new page in her journal and wrote a question that she did not yet have an answer to. What if the 30 days are not for them to prepare? What if the preparation is already done? She looked at it, she almost crossed it out. It seemed too large, too strange. She did not cross it out. On day 27, at the listening post near Verath Space, Commander Dax Aurel received a second message. This one was shorter than the first. It contained a 17-character code sequence and a single instruction: hold until day 30. Then open compartment 7. He acknowledged receipt. He made no other notation in the log. He went back to his regular duties, which were not demanding. The listening post was a quiet station. There was not much to monitor. The Verath systems nearby were operating normally, as far as any external sensor could tell, busy with the movement of a large and confident coalition going about its business. He drank his coffee. He watched the stars. He was not a man who needed things to be exciting to feel that they were meaningful. He had been told, 14 months ago, that his station's position mattered. He had been told what to do when a certain message arrived. He had not been told why, or what the full shape of the plan was, or who else was doing similar things at similar stations in similar quiet corners near Verath Space. He did not need to know. He trusted the people who did. On day 30, Ambassador Voss submitted humanity's formal response to the Galactic Assembly. It arrived through the correct channels, properly formatted, properly filed. The Assembly chair read it into the official record at the start of that morning's session. The response was 3 sentences. The first sentence stated that humanity formally rejected the Verath Coalition's terms in their entirety. The second sentence stated that humanity did not recognize the Coalition's authority to make such demands of a sovereign species, and would not do so under any circumstances. The third sentence stated that any military action taken against human space or human interests would be met with a response proportional to the Verath Coalition's total capacity to wage war, not proportional to the nature or scale of the attack itself, but proportional to the Coalition's total capacity. The chamber sat with this for a moment. Several delegates asked their translators to rerun the third sentence. The translators confirmed they had rendered it correctly. Orin read the response twice. Then he set it down. His expression did not change very much, but something behind his eyes shifted, not to anger, not yet, but to a kind of recalculation. He had expected compliance or a dramatic refusal followed by a show of military force. This was neither. This was something precise and strange. Proportional to the total capacity. He turned to his senior military advisor and told him to move the forward fleet to the staging position. 400 warships. A demonstration. He had done this before. When words did not resolve things, the sight of 400 warships tended to clarify the options available very quickly. His advisor nodded and left to transmit the orders. Orin looked at the response document one more time. He read the third sentence again. He decided it was posturing, the kind of language a species used when it wanted to sound more dangerous than it was. He had heard that kind of language before. It had never meant what it was trying to sound like it meant. He set the document aside. Outside the assembly structure, in the dark and the distance, things that had already been set in motion continued moving, quietly, at exactly the pace they had been designed to move, waiting for nothing, requiring no further instruction, running on their own toward a conclusion that had been planned long before Orin ever stood up to deliver his ultimatum on the assembly floor. The clock had been running for 30 days. It did not stop at 30. The forward fleet moved on schedule. 400 warships. It was not Orin's full military strength, not even close. It was a message written in steel and engine fire, the kind of message that did not require translation. He had used this particular form of communication 11 times in his career, against 11 different civilizations, and every time the recipient had looked at 400 warships crossing into their territory and found, quite suddenly, that the terms being offered were more reasonable than they had initially seemed. The fleet moved in formation. Clean lines, precise spacing, The kind of movement that communicated not just power but control, the suggestion that this was easy, that this was routine, that the entity doing this had done it so many times that it no longer required effort. The fleet admiral, a veteran officer named Korath who had overseen 3 of the coalition's previous absorptions, ran a standard pre-engagement diagnostic as the fleet crossed into the outer transit corridor between coalition space and the first of the 3 demanded human systems. Everything read clean, all systems nominal, 400 ships fully operational, moving at standard approach speed toward a target that had not yet shown a single military vessel in response. Korath was not surprised by the lack of response. He had expected it. The humans had 30 days and had spent them doing almost nothing visible. Whatever they were doing now was probably the same. He filed an initial movement report back to Oren's command and settled in for the transit. The first relay went dark 4 hours into the movement. It was a standard communication relay, one of hundreds positioned throughout the transit corridor to maintain clean signal contact between moving fleets and coalition command infrastructure. This one simply stopped responding. No debris, no energy spike consistent with weapons fire, no distress signal. It was there, and then it was returning no signal at all, as if someone had reached out and turned it off at the source. Korath's communications officer flagged it immediately. Korath reviewed the report and ordered a diagnostic ping from the 2 nearest relay points. Neither got a response. He noted it in the log, marked it for technical investigation, and continued the fleet's movement. Single relay failures happened. Equipment was not perfect. The fleet had direct ship-to-ship communication that did not depend on the relay network for short-range coordination. He did not stop the fleet. 2 hours later, a second relay went dark, then a third 40 minutes after that. Korath looked at the positions of the 3 failed relays on his display. They were not clustered. They were spread across a wide section of the corridor, separated by distances that made simultaneous equipment failure essentially impossible. He stared at the display for a long moment. Then he ordered the fleet to reduce speed by 20%, while his technical teams ran a more thorough diagnostic sweep of the surrounding relay network. The sweep took 90 minutes. It found nothing wrong with any of the remaining relays. All systems returned clean readings. All hardware was operating within normal parameters. While the sweep was running, a 4th relay went dark. At the Galactic Assembly, the session that day was routine. Procedural votes, trade agreement reviews, the kind of work that kept the institution functioning but rarely attracted much attention. Lyrian attended because she attended everything, and because she had developed, over the past several days, the habit of watching the human delegation more carefully than her notes strictly required. Voss sat through the session the same way he sat through every session, present, attentive, quiet. He voted on the procedural matters when humanity had a vote, consulted briefly with his aide twice, and gave no indication that anything outside the chamber was of particular interest to him. Lyrian watched him and thought about the pattern she had found in the historical records. She thought about the 3rd sentence of humanity's response document. She thought about a word she had heard used once by a human diplomat at a social function, years before this post. A word he had used casually, not as a threat, describing something from their history. The word was infrastructure. He had said that the most important wars in human history had not been won with weapons, but with infrastructure, with the slow, invisible work of building the systems that everything else depended on, and understanding those systems better than your enemy did. She had not thought much about it at the time. She was thinking about it now. She pulled up the Assembly's public technical monitoring feed on her secondary display, a dry data stream that most observers ignored entirely. It logged reported anomalies in the communication and navigation infrastructure throughout Assembly-adjacent space. She scrolled back through the past 30 days of entries. She almost missed it. The entries were individually small, A relay outage here, a sensor calibration issue there. A navigation beacon in a transit corridor reporting intermittent signal. None of them had triggered any formal investigation, because none of them had crossed the threshold that would require one. They were each, on their own, nothing. She started marking them on a star map. She worked slowly, checking each entry against its coordinates, placing a small marker at each location. It took her the better part of the session. When she was done, she leaned back and looked at what she had made. The markers were not random. They formed a shape, a rough, wide shape, not geometric but deliberate, the kind of shape that emerged not from a single planned line but from hundreds of individual actions that shared a common logic. The shape enclosed something. She traced its outer edge with her finger, following it across the map. It enclosed Varath Coalition space. All of it. Every marked anomaly sat on or just outside the perimeter of Coalition territory, spaced at irregular intervals that, she realized after a moment, corresponded to the locations of major communication relay clusters. Not a wall, not a fence, something more like the careful, patient removal of every wire connecting a building to the outside world, done one wire at a time, over 30 days, quietly enough that no one noticed until someone looked at all the wires together. She did not move for almost a full minute. Then she very carefully closed the map on her secondary display and did not open it again during the session. She did not write anything in her journal. She kept her face neutral and her attention on the chamber floor and thought, with a cold and creeping clarity, about what she was looking at. If she was right, it had been running the entire time. All 30 days, while Orin was reading clean intelligence reports and the Assembly was rearranging its social architecture around the assumption of a Varath victory, something had been taking apart the Coalition's connection to everything outside itself. Not destroying, removing, quietly. At the pace of a single failed relay here, a single sensor anomaly there, nothing fast enough to trigger alarm, nothing dramatic enough to require response. She was not a military analyst. She was an observer, but she understood, sitting in that chamber with the session proceeding normally around her, that if something was being done to the Coalition's perimeter infrastructure, then the 400 warships currently moving through the transit corridor were moving through a space that was being changed around them without their knowledge. She thought about what that meant for what came next. She thought about the third sentence of the response document, proportional to the total capacity. At the listening post, Aurel opened compartment 7 at exactly the time the instructions had specified. Inside was a data chip and a printed card. The card had 2 lines on it. The first line was a time stamp, a specific moment, still several hours away. The second line was 4 words, input code, do not wait. He read the card twice. He put the data chip into his console's reader and opened the file on it. The file contained a 17-character code and a set of coordinates, not a location, but a network address, a deep infrastructure address, the kind used to access systems at the foundational level, below the operational software that most technicians ever touched. He recognized the type of address. He had worked in infrastructure maintenance early in his career, before this post. He knew what layer of a system this kind of address reached. He sat with that knowledge for a moment. Then he looked at the time stamp on the card. He calculated how long he had. He made himself a fresh cup of coffee, because the time stamp was still 3 hours away, and there was no point in sitting and staring at the console when coffee was available. He drank it slowly. He looked out the viewport at Varath space. It looked the same as it always had. Busy, confident, full of signals and movement and the ordinary noise of a large civilization going about its business, completely unaware that the space around it had been changing for 30 days. At the forward fleet, Koreth called a full stop. 7 relays were now dark. His long-range sensors were beginning to return data that did not match his charts, small discrepancies, nothing catastrophic, but enough that he did not trust the picture they were giving him of the space ahead. Two ships in the rear formation had reported minor propulsion irregularities that their own diagnostics could not explain. He had ordered both ships to hold position and run full system checks. He sent an urgent report to Oren's command. The message traveled through the remaining functional relays and arrived, though it took longer than it should have. Oren read it. He was not alarmed, not yet. Strange technical behavior happened. Fleets encountered interference in transit corridors. He told Korath to hold position, run diagnostics, and report again in 6 hours. He told his intelligence chief to cross-reference the anomalies with any known human weapon signatures or jamming systems. The intelligence chief ran the search. It returned nothing. No known human weapon system matched the pattern of what the fleet was reporting. Oren considered this. He decided it was reassuring. If no known weapon explained it, then no weapon was the likely explanation. Equipment failed. Relays had maintenance cycles. He had 400 ships and a clean path to his objective. He was not going to stop because of relay outages. He sent Korath orders to resume movement at reduced speed, once diagnostics were complete. He poured himself a drink and reviewed the occupation frameworks his advisors had prepared. They were good, thorough. He read them with the quiet satisfaction of someone reviewing work that was nearly done. Behind him, outside the viewport of his command ship, the stars were exactly where they had always been. Still, patient, holding their positions with the indifference of things that had been there long before any of the civilizations currently arguing below them and would be there long after. They did not care about fleet movements. They did not care about relay outages or occupation frameworks or the careful calculations of a consul who had absorbed 12 civilizations and was certain, in the deepest and most comfortable part of his confidence, that he understood exactly what he was dealing with. The clock did not care either. It kept running. The first report reached Oren at dawn by Coalition Standard Time. It was not about the fleet. The fleet was still holding position in the transit corridor, running diagnostics that kept returning clean results, while the systems they were meant to be diagnosing continued to behave strangely. That situation was concerning but contained. What reached Oren at dawn was different. It was a report from the Coalition's Internal Infrastructure Monitoring Division, and it was flagged at the highest priority level his staff had seen used in 11 years. 3 member worlds were reporting power distribution irregularities. Not failures, not blackouts. The systems were running, but they were running at reduced capacity, 40% in 2 cases, 53% in the third. The monitoring division had traced the issue to the distribution management layer, the deep software infrastructure that coordinated how power moved through each world's grid. The management layer was returning operational readings. It said everything was fine. The physical reality of reduced power flowing through the grid said otherwise. Oren read the report standing up. He had not sat down yet. He had the habit of reviewing his first reports of the day before settling in, and this was the kind of report that made sitting feel wrong. He asked his infrastructure chief how long a fix would take. The infrastructure chief said she did not yet know what the problem was, which made estimating a fix impossible. Her teams were working. She would report back within 2 hours. He told her to make it 1 hour. Then he called his military advisor and asked for an update on the forward fleet. The update was the same as the last one: holding position, diagnostics running, no enemy contact, no explanation for the relay failures or the sensor discrepancies. Korath was a steady officer, and his report was calm, but the steadiness of it had a quality that Oren recognized from long experience. It was the steadiness of a man who was holding himself calm, because the alternative was not useful, not because the situation warranted calm. He told his advisor to have Korath resume movement regardless of the diagnostic results. 400 ships did not need perfect sensor data to move toward a target that was not shooting back. Then the second report arrived. The Coalition's shipyard construction network had frozen. Not one shipyard, the network. 14 active construction facilities spread across 8 systems, all in the process of building or refitting vessels at various stages of completion. All 14 had stopped. The automated construction systems had entered a hold state, the kind of state they entered when a safety condition was triggered somewhere in the coordination network that linked them all together. The safety trigger was designed to prevent construction errors when systems detected conflicting instructions from different parts of the network. Someone somewhere in the network had introduced conflicting instructions. Not a virus. The security systems had checked and were still checking. No unauthorized code was present anywhere in the network that the security systems could find. The conflicting instructions appeared to have come from legitimate sources within the network itself, as if 2 different parts of the system had simultaneously decided on 2 different things, and the safety protocol had done exactly what it was designed to do and stopped everything until the conflict was resolved. Resolving it required identifying which instruction was wrong. Both instructions appeared legitimate. Both had the correct authorization signatures. The technical teams had been working on it for 40 minutes before the report reached Oren and had not yet determined which one to override. Oren sat down. He did it slowly, the way a person sits when they are placing themselves carefully rather than simply choosing to be off their feet. He looked at the 2 reports side by side on his display. Power distribution running at reduced capacity on 3 worlds. Shipyard network frozen across 8 systems. He looked at them for a long time without speaking. His senior advisor waited. Oren said quietly, "Bring me everything unusual that has been reported in the past 30 days. Every technical anomaly, every infrastructure irregularity, every maintenance flag that was filed and set aside. Everything." His advisor left to compile it. In the Galactic Assembly, an emergency session had been called. It was not called by humanity. It was called by 3 coalition member states simultaneously, not the core coalition worlds, but the absorbed civilizations on the outer edges of the bloc, the ones that had been integrated in the past 20 years and still maintained their own internal governments under coalition oversight. They were filing reports that their own infrastructure was experiencing problems. They were confused and, underneath the careful diplomatic language, frightened. They wanted the assembly to know. They wanted it on the record. The chamber filled faster than usual. Word traveled quickly when coalition member states filed emergency reports. Every delegation wanted to see what was happening. Lyrian was already in her seat when the session opened. She had barely slept. She had spent most of the night reviewing her star map, adding new data points as the public monitoring feed updated, watching the shape she had identified grow more defined with each new entry. She had also spent an hour reading old human technical documentation, publicly available material, nothing classified, the kind of infrastructure engineering records that any species could access if they thought to look for them. She had found something interesting. Humanity had been involved, over the past 4 decades, in a significant number of infrastructure development projects across this region of the galaxy. Relay networks, navigation beacon systems, power distribution coordination software sold to developing civilizations at favorable rates, deep infrastructure management layers licensed to growing economies that needed reliable systems quickly and could not build their own from scratch. Humanity had been quiet about this. It was not secret. All of it was documented, publicly registered with the Assembly's trade records. It was simply not something anyone had thought to look at as a single picture rather than a collection of separate commercial transactions. She was looking at it as a single picture now. The coalition had absorbed 12 civilizations. Many of those civilizations had, at various points in their development, purchased or licensed human infrastructure systems. The coalition had then inherited those systems when it absorbed the civilizations. It had integrated them into its own network because they worked, because replacing them was expensive, because there was no reason to replace something that was functioning correctly. Until it was not functioning correctly. She understood now what the forward fleet's relay failures were. She understood what the power distribution problems were. She understood what the shipyard network freeze was. She understood why the security systems were not finding any unauthorized code, because the code was not unauthorized. It was exactly what it was supposed to be. It was simply being operated differently than the coalition had assumed it would be. She sat in the chamber and watched the emergency session begin, and said nothing to anyone. Voss sat at the human table. He was listening to the member state reports with the same attentive, neutral expression he always wore. His hands were folded on the table. He had not checked his communications device since entering the chamber. He did not appear to need to. At the listening post, Aurel looked at the time stamp on his card. He had 4 minutes. He did not feel the way he might have expected to feel. He had thought during the hours of waiting that when this moment arrived, he might feel the weight of it more than he did. He was one person at one small post, inputting one code into one console. He was aware, in an abstract way, that there were others doing similar things at similar posts, and that together these actions would combine into something very large. But the largeness of it was not something he could feel from where he was sitting. From where he was sitting, it was just a console, and a code, and a time stamp that was now 2 minutes away. He put his cup down. He pulled up the input interface and positioned his hands over it. The network address from the data chip was already loaded. He had checked it 3 times. It was correct. 1 minute. He looked out the viewport one more time. Verath Space looked back at him, still busy, still confident, still full of the movement and signal of a civilization that had not yet fully understood what was happening to it. He thought about the people out there, ordinary people, not soldiers, not politicians, just the population of 12 absorbed civilizations going about their days. He thought about what this was and what it was not. It was not destruction. No one was going to die from a power distribution system running at reduced capacity. No one was going to die from a frozen shipyard network or a silent relay or a navigation beacon returning slightly incorrect data. What was going to die was the coalition's ability to function as a coordinated military and economic power. That was a different thing. He knew the difference mattered, and he knew that the people who had designed this had known the difference too, because the design reflected it at every level. The timestamp hit 0. He input the code. The confirmation light went green. He let out a slow breath. He did not feel different. The stars outside the viewport looked the same as they always had. He picked up his cup, remembered it was empty, and put it back down. Back in Oren's command chamber, the reports had stopped arriving one at a time. They were arriving in groups now, overlapping, each one flagged urgent, each one describing a different system in a different part of coalition space, exhibiting a different kind of operational problem. The power distribution issues had spread from 3 worlds to 9. The shipyard freeze was still unresolved. The coalition's financial transfer network, the system that moved economic resources between member states, that collected the tribute payments from absorbed civilizations, that paid the salaries of the military fleet, had gone quiet. Not crashed. Quiet. It was returning operational status confirmations. It was simply not moving any money. Oren sat very still and read the reports. His senior advisor had returned with the 30-day anomaly compilation. It was long, much longer than expected. Individually, each entry was small. A relay here, a sensor flag there. A software update applied to a deep management system that the update log showed had been authorized through a legitimate vendor channel. Dozens of small things spread across 30 days, spread across the full geography of coalition space. He read the compilation. He looked at the current reports. He did the thing that a mind does when it finally receives enough pieces to see the shape they make together, and the shape is not what it expected. His voice when he spoke was quiet, almost careful. He asked his advisor, how much of our infrastructure management layer was originally built on human licensed systems? His advisor checked. It took several minutes. The answer, when it came, was not a specific number. It was a range, because the answer was complicated by decades of integration and modification. The range was between 60 and 70%, maybe more, depending on how you counted the systems that had been built on top of human-originated base layers. Oren did not respond immediately. He sat with that number and looked at his reports and thought about the third sentence of humanity's response document and understood, in a way that settled into him like cold water, exactly what the word proportional had meant. Not proportional to the attack, proportional to the total capacity. They had not attacked his fleet. They had not fired a weapon. They had not crossed a border. They had reached into the foundation of everything his coalition depended on to function, and had turned it, slowly, quietly, without announcement, into something they controlled and he did not. He was a general with 400 ships he could not coordinate, in a coalition he could not pay, looking through sensors he could not trust, across a communication network that was going silent relay by relay in every direction he looked. The forward fleet was still intact. His worlds were still intact. His people were still there. Nothing had been destroyed. But an army that cannot be coordinated is not an army. An economy that cannot transfer resources is not an economy. A coalition of 12 civilizations held together by infrastructure and tribute payments, stripped of both, is not a coalition. It is 12 separate civilizations, each one alone, waiting to understand what comes next. He looked at his display for a long time. Then he did something he had not done in 20 years of building his coalition. He called for a secure channel to the assembly, not to threaten, not to negotiate from strength. To talk, the junior diplomat's name was Sesath. He was 26 years old by coalition standard reckoning, and he had been in his current post for 8 months. And nothing in those 8 months or the years of training before them had prepared him for the task he was given on the morning that Oren did not come to the assembly session. Sesath was handed a document. He was told to deliver it to the assembly chair at the opening of the session. He was told to read it aloud if asked. He was told not to add anything, not to answer questions, and not to remain at the podium longer than necessary. He was told these things by Oren's chief of staff, who delivered the instructions with the flat, careful expression of someone who was managing their own reaction very deliberately. Sesath read the document before the session opened. He read it twice. It was short. It said that the Verath coalition formally and unconditionally withdrew the ultimatum delivered to humanity at the previous emergency session. It said the coalition considered the matter closed and wished to proceed with normal assembly business. It said nothing else. There were no conditions. There was no language about future arrangements or salvage terms or face-saving frameworks. There was just the withdrawal, clean and complete, filed through proper channels, attached to no demands. He stood at the podium and read it into the record in a steady voice. He was proud of how steady it was. Then he stepped back and returned to the coalition table and sat down and looked at nothing in particular while the chamber processed what had just happened. The processing took a little while. The assembly chair confirmed the withdrawal for the record. She asked if any delegation wished to respond. There was a pause of several seconds, which was unusual. In most sessions, the pause after an open floor invitation lasted less than 1 second before someone filled it. This pause stretched out because every delegation in the chamber was doing the same thing at the same moment, looking at the human table, waiting to see what Voss would do. Voss stood. He thanked the assembly chair. He said that humanity acknowledged the coalition's withdrawal and considered the matter resolved. He said that humanity bore no ongoing grievance and looked forward to continued stable relations with all assembly members. He said he hoped the session could proceed to its scheduled business, as there were several trade review items on the agenda that deserved proper attention. Then he sat down. The chamber was quiet for a moment that was different from other quiet moments in assembly history. It was not the quiet of shock, exactly, though shock was part of it. It was the quiet of a large number of very intelligent beings, simultaneously revising something they had believed to be true, and finding that the revision required more space than they had initially expected to give it. Lyrian wrote nothing in her journal during that quiet. She just watched. She watched the delegations around the chamber. She watched the way eyes moved, toward the human table, away, toward each other, back again. She watched the Verath table where Sesoth was sitting with his hands flat on the surface in front of him, very still, very young. She watched the non-aligned delegations, the small species that had been drifting toward the coalition in the past 30 days, and she watched the drift reverse in real time. Not dramatically, not with any announcement, just the subtle repositioning of bodies in chairs and the slight change in where attention was directed that meant the invisible social architecture of the chamber was rearranging itself again, back and then past its original position, into something new. The session proceeded, the trade reviews were conducted, the assembly did its work. Voss sat through all of it. That evening, back in her quarters, Lyrian began writing her official report. She was a thorough writer and she worked slowly, checking her notes against her memory, making sure the sequence of events was accurate and the language was precise. The report would go into the non-aligned archive, where it would be accessible to any member species that requested it. It would be the most complete account of the incident from a neutral perspective. She knew this and she felt the weight of it, and she wrote carefully. She wrote about Oren's ultimatum and the chamber's reaction. She wrote about Voss's response and the 30-day period, and the way the assembly's informal alignment had shifted during that time. She wrote about the forward fleet and the relay failures and the infrastructure reports that had come in during the emergency session. She wrote about the withdrawal. She wrote all of it accurately. She was a professional, and the accuracy was not something she considered compromising, even when the facts were uncomfortable for her own analysis, which had been wrong in several important ways that she noted plainly in the text. Then she reached the final paragraph. She sat with it for a long time before she wrote anything. She had been a professional observer for 19 years. She had documented 32 significant assembly events. She had a clear, established voice for this kind of writing, neutral, precise, careful with interpretation. She knew how to write about things she found difficult to categorize. She found that the usual approach was not quite working for this one. She wrote the paragraph 4 times. She deleted the first 3. The fourth one she kept, not because it was perfect, but because it was honest, and honesty was the only standard she had ever held herself to that she trusted completely. She wrote that she had arrived at this posting expecting to document the slow, unhappy capitulation of a species that had been outmatched before it understood it was in a contest. She wrote that this was not what she had documented. She wrote that she had instead documented something for which her language had no clean word, and she had spent considerable time looking for one. War was not right because there had been no battle. Siege was not right because there had been no defined perimeter and no moment of encirclement. Defeat was not right because the coalition's forces were intact, its worlds were standing, its people were unharmed. The closest word she had found was erasure. Not the erasure of the coalition itself, it still existed, diminished and recalibrating but present. The erasure of a condition. The condition that the coalition had believed to be true about itself and about humanity and about the space between them, which was that the coalition was the most dangerous thing in that space and humanity was not. That condition had been erased, not argued against, not defeated in a confrontation. Simply removed, the way you removed something by demonstrating, without any drama at all, that it had never been accurate. She wrote that the most unsettling part was not what humanity had done. It was how long they had been doing it before anyone thought to look. 40 years of infrastructure development. 40 years of relay networks and power management systems and navigation software, placed carefully and licensed generously across a region of space that humanity had apparently understood, long before anyone else did, would eventually matter in exactly this way. 40 years of preparation for a moment that might never have come, maintained patiently and without any visible sign of intent, until the moment did come, and the preparation was simply there, already done, waiting to be used. She did not know how to write about a species that thought that way. She was not sure her framework for understanding civilizations had a place to put it. She submitted the report at midnight. Then she closed her display and sat in the dark for a while and thought about what it meant to share a galaxy with something that planned across generations for contingencies it hoped would never occur, and did so quietly, without announcement, and apparently without any difficulty maintaining the patience required. It was not a comforting thought. It was not meant to be. She did not think comfort was the appropriate response to accurate information. At the human listening post, the stand-down message arrived at mid-morning. Orel was running his standard daily diagnostic when it came in, a routine he maintained with the same consistency regardless of what else was happening, because routines were what kept a one-person posting from becoming formless. He set the diagnostic to run on its own and opened the message. It was 4 words and a sign-off: "Stand down, good work." He read it. He filed it in the correct log folder. He sat back in his chair and looked out the viewport at Verath space, which looked the same as it always had, and always would, full of stars and distance, and the ordinary movement of civilizations going about the long, complicated business of existing. He thought about the past 30 days. He thought about the moment he had input the code, the green confirmation light, the anticlimactic steadiness of everything that followed. He thought about the fact that he had no clear picture of everything that had happened. He knew his piece, his station, his single action in a sequence of actions he had not been given the full map of. That was fine. He had learned a long time ago that you did not need to see the whole shape to do your part of it well. He pulled his diagnostic results up, everything clean. He noted it in the log. Then he made coffee. He took it to the viewport and stood there for a few minutes, not thinking about anything in particular, just looking at the stars. They were the same stars that had been there before all of this. They would be there after. They had a quality that he had always found steadying, the way they simply continued, regardless of what the small and busy things below them were doing, holding their positions with a patience that made every urgency seem temporary. He drank his coffee slowly. It was good coffee. He had always been particular about his coffee, and he did not think that was a small thing. Small things done well were the substance of most days and most lives, and there was nothing wrong with that. Outside, Verath space was quieter than it had been a week ago. The signals were fewer, the movement reduced. Things were still not working the way they had before, and the process of working out what had happened and how to address it would take the coalition's technical teams a long time. Some of what had been done could be undone. Some of it could not without rebuilding infrastructure from a foundation that the coalition now understood it did not fully control. That understanding, Orel thought, was probably the most lasting thing. Not the disruption itself, which would be repaired in time, but the knowledge underneath it. The coalition knew something now that it had not known before. Every other species in the assembly knew it too. The knowledge would change things, quietly and permanently, in the way that true knowledge always did. Across the galaxy, in hundreds of assembly halls and diplomatic offices and military planning rooms, species were doing what Lyrian had done, pulling up records, reviewing trade histories, looking at infrastructure maps, asking questions they had not thought to ask before. How much of what they depended on had passed through human space at some point? How deep did the connections go? How far back did the preparation extend? Most of them were not going to get clean answers. because the answers were complicated and spread across decades of ordinary-looking commercial activity that had not seemed worth examining closely at the time. That was part of the point, though none of them would have said so out loud. Some species were already sending quiet diplomatic messages to human embassies. Not threats, not demands, something more careful than either, the kind of message a civilization sent when it was trying to understand its position relative to another civilization and had just realized it had been operating on incorrect assumptions for a very long time. The messages were courteous. The human embassies responded courteously. Nothing dramatic was said in any of them. Voss, back at the assembly, attended the next 3 sessions as if nothing had changed. He voted on trade reviews. He participated in a subcommittee meeting about navigation beacon maintenance standards, which several delegations found difficult to look at without thinking about things they were not sure they wanted to think about. He had lunch in the common dining area with 2 delegates from non-aligned species who had requested the meeting. He was pleasant company. He did not bring up the past 30 days, neither did they. Admiral Dravik, on her mobile command station, reviewed the final operational reports from every post and position that had been involved. She read each one carefully. She made 2 notations in her personal log. Then she archived the operational file, marked it complete, and moved on to the next item on her schedule, which was a routine readiness review for a completely different contingency. It was a different contingency, in a different region of space, involving a different set of variables and a different set of preparations that had been running quietly in the background for several years already. She did not expect it to become necessary. She rarely expected the contingencies to become necessary. That was the nature of preparation. You built it hoping it would never be used, and you built it carefully anyway, because hope was not a strategy, and the galaxy was large and full of species that had not yet learned what the Varath Coalition had just learned. Some of them would learn it the same way. Most of them, she believed, would not need to. The lesson had been given clearly enough that it would travel, in the way that important lessons traveled through the assembly, slowly at first, then everywhere at once. She moved on to the readiness review. The stars outside her viewport were the same stars they had always been. They did not mark the occasion. They did not need to. They had been there when the preparation began, 40 years ago, in rooms and meetings and small decisions that no one had thought to look at carefully. They would be there 40 years from now, unchanged, patient, holding their positions across distances that made everything happening below them seem very small and very brief. But the things happening below them were not small. Not always. Sometimes the small and quiet work of patient minds accumulated into something that changed the shape of what was possible, and the shape stayed changed, and the galaxy woke up one morning in a slightly different world than it had gone to sleep in. It did not announce itself when this happened. It never did. It just was the new shape of things, sitting where the old shape used to be, obvious only in retrospect, built from 40 years of relays and software licenses, and a single ambassador who thanked his adversary for the clarity of his terms and asked for 30 days and sat down without raising his voice. The stars held their positions. The coffee at the listening post was good. The work was done.